Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Dave, my friend and one of our pastors here, is joining me today. Dave, thanks for being here.
Glad to be on. Can't wait to get into it.
We discovered at the beginning of this episode that this is episode 200. So we have nothing special to mark this except just a normal podcast.
We, for men's Bible study this morning, we started teaching through the book of Ecclesiastes and about the vanity and meaninglessness of a lot of the toil that we spend our time dedicated to. So, you know, episode 200, episode 300.
That's right.
It doesn't really matter.
I love what you said, though, in reflection of that. Here we are. We're going to have a good conversation. We're here with our friends. I'm here with you and Jesse. You have a good cup of coffee.
Ecclesiastes would teach us, like, whatever the Lord has for you to do today in your work, that's God's gift to you. So enjoy it. And whatever good things are in front of you, a friend sitting across from you, a cup of coffee, a chocolate ball that we had shortly before coming on air. These are all the good things God's given us. And so we'll enjoy it and enjoy this conversation.
Yeah. Although you said your sons ran a slightly different way with having heard you teach on Ecclesiastes this morning. Yeah, they went a slightly different way with the application.
Well, they had always had a sense that school was meaningless. Now they feel like they have some biblical justification for that sense that they've had for a while. They don't have to. Like, really, what value is AP Stats with perspective of eternity? Mm-hmm. You know, so that immediate short term, it was a backfire. But I think long term, hopefully they'll get the vision of where work fits from the perspective of eternity, but not yet. Right now, it's just all a vapor.
Yeah. Right now, they're like, we knew school was meaningless. This is proof.
Yeah. It says so right there in the Bible.
It says so. Well, Dave, thanks for joining me today. Glad that you and the men's Bible study started teaching Ecclesiastes today. That puts our podcast episode in a great frame of reference. We'll enjoy this discussion. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully those of you listening can adopt the same mentality about your day, the good work God has given you and the good gifts he's given you to enjoy in it today. We hope all of that is true for you also. Today, we are responding to a listener question. So we call these Q&R episodes. I encourage regularly our listeners to send in questions, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they listen and send us a question.
It isn't all just vainly you talking into a microphone that goes up into a mist, Autumn.
No,
people respond.
Sometimes they listen and respond.
Amazing.
Oh, another funny anecdote. Dave and his wife Renee and Jesse have another podcast that is called No Quitting the Home Team. And our podcast at fellowshipdenver.org got an email this week congratulating you, Dave.
Thank you.
And Renee and Jesse.
Thank you on behalf of Renee.
That No Quitting the Home Team has really caught fire in Zimbabwe.
We're on fire there.
It's like in the top 100 Christian podcasts in Zimbabwe.
I know.
So
we have a
congrats.
big listenership.
Yeah.
New York and Zimbabwe.
Wow.
Who knew?
Who knew?
Those would be big pockets of listeners.
Yeah, Renee said, who knew there was a market for a sarcastic marriage to really take off in the listeners in
Maybe
Zimbabwe.
the Zimbabwean culture, of which I'm ignorant of, really, maybe we should visit and we'd really resonate with the culture there.
Maybe so. So sometimes I get emails like that to the podcast email, and other times I get a very thoughtful question, like the one that we're about to address today. So thank you to our listener for sending in this question. I'm going to read it. It's the question itself it strings together a few questions. So I'll read through it, and then we'll break down the different questions into different parts of our response and conversation. So our listener question says, I received an email from a Christian organization that used the language, quote, tragic injustice, end quote, to describe the anticipated effect of the new administration on refugees and immigrants. When a Christian organization claims a policy is unjust, but it seems that there are costs on both sides for multiple groups, is this an appropriate application of the term injustice? Should we as Christians support national policy that elevates the needs of a foreigner or immigrant at the cost of the needs of locals, including people who have already immigrated and are living among us, who are intimately tied to our country's financial security and ability to support people over time? To be clear, I'm not talking about extending personal compassion and financial support to people in need. That's an appropriate response. Maybe, to put it another way, can a Christian organization call a policy unjust simply because it limits access to a resource that itself is limited and which, if not guarded, may be detrimental for a different group? Or is it more accurate to call out the costs on both sides, as well as biblical examples for guarding and protecting your own house with wisdom? How do you weigh whose needs are considered more important?
Well, it's a very thoughtful question, and we kind of thought maybe we'd frame up our response to it by discussing something that we talk about and teach about a lot in our Ministry Foundations class. Autumn, you and I, we've been teaching together that for a long time now, and we just taught through and currently teaching through justice and generosity and these big, grand biblical concepts that are rife throughout Scripture that dictate what is a right society, and what does it mean to interact rightly with each other and with God, and what do we do when it's misaligned and when it's not rightly ordered, and so we've been talking a lot about this, and so maybe it's good just to lay a framework. Now, in Scripture, there are these big ideas, and we can read about this in Proverbs. I think that's a great place to be introduced to big ideas, such as, and we read about this in Proverbs 1, biblical wisdom gives us insight into what's known as righteousness, justice, equity, and then this fourth virtue quality called mercy. So righteousness, justice, equity, and mercy. Proverbs and biblical wisdom is going to teach that people who are associated with God, His will being done on earth, need to be concerned with these things because these are things that God Himself is concerned about. So, what is righteousness? Righteousness, from the perspective of biblical wisdom, is this idea that, from a societal perspective, that everyone who lives, functions within a particular societal system, that they all fit in a system in such a way that they could experience blessing or flourishing. It doesn't mean that there isn't hierarchy. Certainly, Proverbs has hierarchy that's very easily discernible. You have God, you have the king, you have nobles, and then you have like the workers. But then you also have the animal kingdom, and then you have plants and the earth as well. And they all kind of fit within this ecosystem of the kingdom that Proverbs is giving this vision of. And a righteousness is when everyone who's within that kingdom is in right relationship with each other and ultimately with God. And you know it because they experience flourishing and blessing. So
blessing flows down from God to the king, to the nobles. If the king is in right relationship with God, then that blessing, he manifests it. He represents God in the way that is depicted and imagined in Scripture. And then that blessing flows through to the nobles. If they are in right relationship with the people, then they are arbiters of justice and blessing to the people, and the people to the animals and the earth. And everyone is stewarded within that hierarchy and experiences blessing.
And it's characterized by rejoicing. So so when there's righteousness, they're like when the righteous rise, the people rejoice, like the cities rejoice, and even the animals, like they're not exploited either, and then it trickles all the way down to crops. The land itself isn't exploited, and you should expect good, fruitful crops when it's stewarded appropriately. So that's righteousness. Now, when things are unrighteous, so when the king acts out of step and misuses his power, when the nobles, rather than thinking, how do I have the people in my land flourish, rather begin to see those peoples as resources to be exploited. And when those people then in turn do the same thing to their little realms of influence, exploitation exists, then that's unrighteousness. So righteousness is really about discerning, is there flourishing in every facet of society? When you discern that it isn't, then the second category of justice comes into play. Justice is more proactive. It's more the thing that you do to actively fix the unrighteousness. So it's the doing. So how do we actively intervene and fix where there is unrighteousness? So you read a little bit about this in Proverbs 31, the very beginning, before it gets into the depiction of a wise woman. There's this message from a mom to her son who is king, and she says to the king that he is actively to understand and know the rights of the poor, of people within his kingdom, and if he doesn't remember it because he's too self-indulgent, then that's explicitly unrighteous. But if he does remember the rights of the poor, then he can act on their behalf. And so he has to be the mouth of the mute. He has to actively use his position to help fix the injustice that exists for those within his kingdom. So it's proactive. So justice then is what do we do? Now, equity, the third characteristic, is all about fairness. There's this category of righteous scales and unrighteous scales, and you can think of like weights. And the idea is that God loves within, in and amongst his people, he loves righteous scales, which means that what weighs one thing for one person is going to weigh the same thing for another person, that there is the impartiality there. And conversely, it says that God actually, it's an abomination. Like God hates unrighteous scales. So when unfairness sort of reigns amongst his people aren't being treated fairly amongst each other. That's not just, oh, well, whatever, that just kind of that's how the cookie crumbles. No, it's actually something God hates. It's an abomination. He's really strong language around that. And so to embrace righteousness and justice and equity means we actually care about fairness.
I think it's interesting, Dave, the way that Jesus applies that idea of equity in the New Testament in terms of people is that his idea, his understanding of equity is not to say that everyone is positionally the same in terms of no hierarchy, but that everyone positionally, by virtue of the gospel, is the same. And yet he also says that everyone is held to account according to actually their position in that hierarchy. And he says that what is just about it is that all will be judged according to God's standard. And all will be judged according to God's standard based on the position and responsibility that he has granted to them. So there's this interesting application of that idea of equity as it applies to judgment in Jesus' teaching.
Right. And as it applies to the little judgments that we mete out every day and how we interact with each other. So he'll say in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. With the measure you use, it's used against you. There is this kind of principle of fairness that Jesus expects within the kingdom, that we that's like a rule that functions within our operations with each other, sort of day in, day out as well.
And that fairness is actually not the way that we normally envision it, that it's within what we call the golden rule. Treating each other the way that fairness is brought about is when we actually do that, when we treat each other as we ourselves would like to be treated, when we love each other as we love ourselves. That is how fairness is brought about. That's
right. And then the final category, sort of within sort of biblical wisdom understanding of righteousness in society, is this idea of mercy. And mercy isn't fixing unrighteousness. Mercy isn't doing justice, like it's not fixing a problem. Mercy is more about alleviating suffering. So it's feeding the hungry. It's tending to the vulnerability of the marginalized. And it's not the work that necessarily is going to fix it for tomorrow. But it's alleviating suffering right now for today. Now, so that's an act of mercy. And so, for example, it's not teaching a man to fish, but it's just giving a guy a piece of fish so that he's satisfied today and he survives today. We care about mercy too. So it's the big societal, structural issue, righteousness. It's justice, doing what you can within your realm of responsibility to fix it, justice. It's having an eye towards fairness, equity, and then it's acts of mercy. All of those sort of fit together to kind of create a social ethic that you see certainly within the Old Testament, and then manifest in the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament, and then expressed in really creative, beautiful ways in the church later in the New Testament.
All of what you described is summed up and explained in the Old Testament by the word shalom. And this depiction of multiple people being like fibers woven together, bringing about making a beautiful tapestry or cloth is what's depicted when we live righteously in right relationship with God and each other, when we actively address areas of unrighteousness and care for those who are suffering. Then this is the image that we get, a society that is strong and vibrant, in which, as you said before, all of the different people and the animals and the earth itself flourish. And so that's the image of God's kingdom that's presented to us through those categories, through these different ways that the Bible describes relational righteousness and justice. All right. I'm just going to pivot then to saying, okay, let's start taking on then. So this establishes kind of the picture. Okay. Dave, I never get tired of hearing you describe that. I think the imagery is so vivid, and that depiction of righteousness and a righteous society in which everyone and the earth flourishes is what we long for. That is what we hope for. And
I think you like that I include the animals and
I do.
The land
I do.
as
yeah.
Being raised on the farm.
Everyone who knows me knows that this is you're just appealing to, the Wendell-Berryan part of my own values and the things that I love dearly. So it's true. But it also is true that is a part of the picture of not only the creation intent, but then the coming kingdom. That within the restoration of all creation, this is part of what we can anticipate.
Yeah.
is that no people are exploited, and that the earth, the resources that are given us to steward, to use wisely to bring about more flourishing, that we also aren't exploiting those resources. So yes, I do. It's true. I appreciate that. All right. So now we've established this is the biblical depiction of righteousness and justice within those 4 categories that you gave us. So let's now address our listener's question, while bearing in mind that we live in a society that, although it has redemptive echoes, as do all cultures, we know that we don't live in a world characterized by biblical righteousness and justice. The fabric is not whole. We don't experience shalom as we hope to and know that we are promised to in the coming kingdom. But as the people of God, that's actually what we're called to, is to live out that kingdom ethos now. So let's look at our listener question. And as with all of these episodes, in our Q&R episodes, many times we're responding to something that we can't fully answer, but biblical wisdom does give us a way to think about it and address it. So we'll respond and hope that this encourages and provokes more thought on the part of our listeners. So I'm not going to reread the entire listener question, but there are a couple of questions bound up in here. Is it appropriate to say something is unjust if in a given situation, more than one party is suffering or feeling the effects of it? So that's one part of our listener question. And then at the end of the question, our listener asks, can a Christian organization call a policy unjust simply because it limits access to a resource that itself is limited and which, if not guarded, might be detrimental for a different group? Or is it more accurate to call out the cost on both sides, as well as biblical examples for guarding and protecting your own house with wisdom? How do you weigh whose needs are considered more important? So one of the points of tension that our listener is wrestling with is, does a nation have, in that she invokes the specific situation in our country, refugees or immigrants and citizens or existing Americans, which includes, of course, many immigrants. So does a nation have a commitment to its own citizens in a way that might limit access for that requires it to limit access for non-citizens? So this is one of the points of tension in this question.
It is. And so how do we begin to think about this biblically? Think about it Christianly, but with Jesus as his disciple, how would he have us process this? Well, we do have a lot of rich biblical theological resources to help inform how we think about this particular question. We can start from a personal basis. So now, obviously, the question is nationally, mm-hmm. and the questioner is saying, I'm not talking about should I be willing to give financially, and I get what the questioner is saying, but mm-hmm. I think in terms of
that's sort of the category of mercy.
It is.
This listener is saying, I understand that we should have compassion and meet real needs. So
yes,
is a given.
Yes, and so to make sure that that's reinforced, Jesus couldn't be any clearer in terms of where the outsider or the foreigner ought to fit within our thinking as Christians. So when judgment is depicted famously at the end of Matthew, one of the ways that Jesus sort of metes out judgment is based on how it is that we treated the foreigner or the outsider. I was a foreigner and you didn't let me in, or I was a foreigner and you let me in. So, and the idea of foreigner or outsider there in that depiction is someone who's not a part of your tribe, someone who doesn't who quote unquote doesn't belong. Jesus very clearly thinks that that a true follower of his will have an impulse and action personally to receive that person and to care for them. Clearly, within the vast sort of teachings of Jesus on who is neighbor, who is my neighbor, he is contrasting the common understanding that my neighbor is not just someone who lives next to me, but is my fellow kinsman, and so of course we are going to help our neighbor who's our fellow kinsman. Jesus radically reorients that whole framework. He blows it up by saying that my neighbor isn't not who my neighbor is, but am I the neighbor, right? And am I going to be the good neighbor who helps the person who's in need, and the person who's in need right in front of you, that's going to be your neighbor. So, and it's depicted by a Samaritan who is being the good neighbor, and he's the example. And Jesus, of course, is throwing a lot of ethnocentristic values on its head by using the illustration that he does with Jew-Samaritan tension sort of right at the fever pitch. So Jesus teaching about our posture towards the neighbor can never be questioned. Like, it's there. So whatever the answer to the broader question is about nationally, should we support policies that help the refugee, the immigrant, whatever that answer is, it has to be informed by this clear teaching of Jesus that we are concerned about the outsider. We leave the 99 to go after the one. So there's all of these sort of reinforcing principles in the teaching of Jesus. Now, does that then follow that policies on a national level should then always favor the outsider at the expense of the insider? Okay, now that's a slightly different question. We should still go to the Bible to see, okay, how are there examples even within the church and the early church and among the disciples of Jesus where resources were allocated in clear and ordered ways? And the answer to that is yes. There were clear ways. So there is a notion that there are more and less righteous recipients of support and resources that the church, who's sort of within sort of a New Testament theology, the church kind of represents a taste of God's kingdom and God's order today. So I do think it can be used sort of representatively in many respects for how policy ought to function. And it goes something like this. Paul says, for example, there was a group of people who were particularly vulnerable, and they were widows. If you were widowed, there's no Social Security, and the church very radically took care of widows financially within the church. This, of course, echo of an ethic that existed within Israel. So it wasn't a new concept to take care of widows. Nevertheless, it was a powerfully practiced in the early church. And yet Paul very clearly said that not all widows are in the exact same situation. And so if you're young and you have the capacity and the desire to marry, then by all means marry. That way, financially, you can be taken care of with your husband and now part of his household, and then it relieves some of the financial pressure of the church that then can be redistributed somewhere else. He also had another provision. Just because you were poor or didn't have the capacity, or you happened to be hungry at any given moment, that wasn't just a flat reason for the church to give you food. Paul very clearly elsewhere said, I say, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. So if you are able-bodied, if you have the capacity to work, then by all means, you should do so. And we're going to withhold giving resources until you do so. So there's a bit of a tough love dynamic there. It wasn't just a blindly giving out resources to anyone who happens to be hungry. No, there was more or less righteous recipients of that resources that were divvied out within the church. So there's that. Now, there are other reasons not to preference one group or the other, and those reasons not to use, this is now the category of fairness, was, again, within the church, how resources were given to widows. You were not to use ethnic divisions as a basis for resources. This, of course, happened very naturally within the early church. We read about it in Acts 7, where resources were given to the Hebrew widows, but not to the Hellenistic widows. That was unfair. It was unjust scales. Powerfully, the apostles addressed it right away. They created a structural fix for it by creating what we now call the diaconate and established people over that ministry to righteously distribute the needs within the church, so that it wasn't, there was no favoritism based on ethnic division. So we have examples within the church of different ways resources are divvied out. Some people get them. Other people, for certain real reasons, don't get them. But no matter how it's divvied out, it's all done for their benefit. And all of this is done within the church as well, which is a whole other now category. What about those outside of the church? Jesus very powerfully taught, you really see this in the Gospel of John, this idea of love one for another. And he very clearly believed that the world, and think of the world, those who aren't believers, those who aren't a part of the church, they will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. Mm-hmm. In other words, Jesus thought, based on our sacrificial love for each other and by Christians within the family of God, we are to actually demonstrate really sacrificial love for each other. You see this again in Acts, where people give up and they sell their own resources and distribute it among the needs within the church. You have the church, the mostly Gentile church, giving sacrificially to the church in Jerusalem, who's experiencing this massive famine. But it's all like sacrificially giving within the household of God. Did they just forget about those outside of the household of God? No. Right. The whole orientation of why we care for one another in the sacrificial way is actually for the benefit of those outside the church. Mm-hmm. It actually makes the church massively attractive and interesting. And so Jesus thought, people will know you're my disciple. People outside the church will know you're my disciple by your love for one another. Mm-hmm. This is Paul's missionary methodology. Why he went to the Gentiles? He's like, I magnify my ministry to the Gentiles so that my kinsmen, according to the flesh, they will essentially see the party of God's kingdom and be drawn into the beauties of the gospel and be drawn into Jesus and into the church. So now all of this, you kind of put all of this together, and I do think it begins to give some deeply biblical, gospel-oriented frameworks for how we begin to understand the role of policy on a broader national basis.
A couple of things to what you said, Dave. That is such a helpful description and does, as you're saying, give us some good ways to begin to think about. Here are the ways of the kingdom, this demonstration of the way that God's people existed together, some wise principles that we can begin to apply. As you were describing the distribution, I thought throughout Scripture, the ethos of God's kingdom is one of generosity and abundance. And even within that, so two specific examples that came to mind, within that, there is a prevailing notion that sits right alongside it. There's abundance and generosity, and the distribution is to each as they have need. So I thought of the Israelites when God provided food for them in the wilderness. And when he provided manna, Moses gave them very specific instructions about when to collect it and how much to collect. So they were freely provided for. God was going to provide all that they needed, and the distribution was as each person had need. So in that instance, it was according to how many members of the household there were, and they were to follow that pattern that God set. So it's a demonstration of abundance in God's kingdom and a specific sort of distribution that is according to the values of God's kingdom. And then I think of the story of the loaves and fishes as well, that it was what seemed a very limited resource. And obviously there's a spiritual lesson in this as well. But in depicting this ethos of God's kingdom, similarly, we see that Jesus miraculously provided, addressed the specific need. It's this demonstration of sustenance and abundance that is part of the ethos of God's kingdom. And there's a distribution to, presumably in the same manner, all who were there according to what they needed to meet and satisfy the need, the actual hunger of all. And then when I think about the way that Paul is giving instructions to the church in what you were describing, there's the same prevailing ethos within God's kingdom, within the church. There are these resources, and the way that we wisely distribute them is to each as they have need. And so he invokes another wisdom principle in what you were saying, the explanation that someone who is able-bodied and can work should work. So he's saying, yes, within God's kingdom there's abundance. We will make sure that this distribution is to all as they have need. And some of the needs are not equivalent to the others. So there is a way in which, a righteous way, in which then those resources are actually distributed. So I thought that there's like this prevailing understanding of the provision within God's kingdom and a wise way, again, to steward it and use it. Now, to drill down on what you were saying, that within this big understanding, so wise distribution of resources, the reasons Paul gives for those, and then the instructions repeatedly in the New Testament to care for those within the household of God, even as you said, imploring the church at Corinth to give to the church, and then holding up the churches in Macedonia as giving to the church at Jerusalem. There's this ordered sort of distribution, but never exclusively for the purpose of hoarding resources. It's always for the purpose of still opening up the invitation into God's kingdom to all, and that the barriers in any of these scenarios that we've discussed are never because of race or social class. So the invitation into the church, to God's family, to God's kingdom and the distribution of resources is never actually to be predetermined by those categories. Even though it is ordered, it's for the purpose of demonstrating God's love to the community, to bearing witness to the surrounding community, and to being able to continue to extend blessing then outward from the family of God. So in asking then, how does that actually start to help us understand maybe righteous use of policy, and to start to extrapolate, how do these wisdom principles help us as Christians start to think about then our listeners' question? I'm going to point us back towards this one aspect of the question. Is it more accurate to call out the cost on both sides, as well as biblical examples for guarding and protecting your own house with wisdom?
So there's a personal way we can begin to apply this principle. Think of our own homes. As a mom and as a dad with our children in our own homes, is it true that we are responsible for the well-being of our children? The answer, of course, is yes. We are responsible to God for their well-being. 100%, absolutely. Now, if someone knocks on our door and asks for a ton of resources, now, what's our attitude towards that person? Well, hopefully, given our understanding of helping the outsider and the stranger, of course, we are to be mindful of that person. Do we give to that person in such a way that actually takes away and diminishes the well-being of our own children? Okay, well, at some point, there is a primary, I think, responsibility to God for our spouse and our children and their flourishing. That's righteous. Think of righteousness. And as there is flourishing, we give and care for those who are outside. So I think that, and I'd be curious to get feedback. We've talked about this among our staff before, as like an example to kind of think about with policy. So if we do properly take care of our family, then we will have abundant resources that then we will be in position to take care of not just the person who knocks on our door, but maybe an entire neighborhood, blocks of people. If we don't care about the well-being and the flourishing of our own family, but we do care about those who are on the outside at their expense, then eventually you can't take care of either, right? So I do think basic principles of stewardship hold here in matters of issues of policy. So to that question about policy, if it's true, it's an either or. Mm-hmm. So a policy is either going to help the refugee or it's going to help the poor, lower middle class family in America that they just need some financial help. It's going to be either or. If that's true, which sometimes I don't know if that's always true in how it's presented.
Right.
Then I do think this principle might be helpful to apply. Obviously, if our own nation is failing, it's diminished, there's no flourishing, then what kind of resources and help are we going to be of benefit to and provide for others? The answer is obvious. So I do think there is a principle there that holds. I think in terms of the sort of reactionary language that our listener is responding to from the Christian nonprofit that reactionarily says that this immediate policy shift is an act of injustice, and any right-thinking Christian will respond in the same way that they would want them to respond. I do feel like the wise response is actually to push pause on that. Maybe that is, maybe it isn't. The Christian response isn't to be reactionary, but it's actually to be informed, to understand, okay, where are the resources? Who are the people who these resources are going to be distributed to? And then what most honors God and what benefits our neighbor, as defined by Jesus. What benefits the household of God, what benefits the insiders, and how do we operate in a way that is concerned about the plight of the outsider? Mm-hmm. Whatever the answer to that question is in the specific situation, I think now we're getting into how to properly respond to policy shifts.
Mm-hmm. I think it is always a difficult conversation to invoke these kinds of questions, in that we definitely can apply biblical principles, but knowing that the setting of Scripture was written in such a different, such a radically different time. And so our understanding of nations is just different than when the entire Bible was written. There's some similarities, but many differences. But I do think that the principle about governments being charged by God to establish justice for their citizens applies here, applies to our government as well. And so if the laws of a given place and the policies of a given place are to do that, to bring about justice for the inhabitants of a certain nation, with boundaries drawn such as they are in the time that we live, then I do think what you were saying a moment ago, Dave, can apply, in that the question, are we wisely stewarding our resources? So asking this from the perspective of government. Is the government of a given place wisely stewarding their existing resources such that they can bring about the flourishing of the people who they are legally tasked to provide for? I think that can apply. And then a Christian perspective would say our hope as Christians is that, in terms of policy, that our government would wisely steward resources so that we could not only bring about flourishing for our, I'm using this loosely, but for the citizens of a given place, but then to extend that in the mindset of abundance and generosity to other people in need. So that's the way personally that I would think through our discussion today, and then think through a given policy. And if it's addressed, then let's say in Denver, we would hope that the policies of our city are such that the needs of the people in Denver are met, that the needs of those who have big needs could feasibly be met. And then a wise stewarding of our resources might also allow for us to care for additional people who have needs. This is the extension of blessing that is depicted in the kingdom of God. So that said, this is the distinct call of the church. Mm-hmm. And so while we would hope this happens through governmental policy, that would be reflected, we would say that that's a righteous reflection in governmental policy. That often is not true. And being the local church, though, the body of God in any place, we are still called to do just that, to live in that way.
That's right. And I will just add a note here that might muddy the waters, but I hope not. Hopefully it will actually expand our understanding of this discussion. And that is the very idea, the radical idea within the early church, based on the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus was Lord, not just of the Jews, but he was the world's true Lord. That everyone actually around the world, all the nations actually were subject to Jesus. And part of their radical message of going to the ends of the earth is the proclamation of Jesus as Lord. That combined with Jesus' clear message himself that the disciples of Jesus were to go into all the ethnoi, all the nations, and not change the nations. Like not make them Jewish, which was sort of the big sort of missional aha moment of the early church, that you don't have to become Jewish in order to enjoy the benefits of God's kingdom and the life of the Messiah, but that you can remain distinctly Gentile and Greek and barbarian, and as the different Gentiles were then distinguished among the peoples, among the nations, that this beautiful diversity of the people, of different people groups, and their like cultural ways of interacting with each other that constitute government, distinct governments, that is actually baked into this idea of mission, that wherever the gospel goes, it's not making a single government. It's actually it's expanding God's kingdom that's going to be distinctly manifest within the uniqueness of each individual people group or nation. This is why even when we have a vision of sort of when the kingdom comes in full, in Revelation, you have people worshiping God in multitude of languages, which means it's not a unicultural mission forward, isn't a unicultural event. Mm-hmm. It's all the different distinctions among the people. That then is actually expressed governmentally as well. And so kingdom principles and the gospel shapes and forms those nations, but they're to be distinct and unique. They're not to be unicultural. That's not the vision of mission that we see forward from Jesus. So this is important because questions of policy like this, we need to, I think, hold it in a place that is appropriate for what we're responsible for in our little piece, slice of the world where we live, in our little cultural kind of cocktail. And then actually hold it, I think, a little bit more loosely for other cultural contexts to see and appreciate that the gospel and the church and how it works in a different country might look a little differently, and it might not be wrong. It might actually be appropriate for where they're at. There needs to be, I think, a little bit more of emotional flexibility for how certain policies might manifest in different cultural contexts.
I think that is such a good word, Dave. In big conversations, it can be easy to forget that really we are called to be the people of God where we're at, and that the design that Jesus laid out for his followers was to become bodies of believers in many locales, and in that way to spread over the face of the earth. And so we're called to be the family of God in the place where we live, and in our church, our community. This is where we have the biggest potential impact and the immediate call to steward our resources. And so bringing back that reminder, not only of the nature of the kingdom of God that you just described, but of our actual responsibility in it, is so helpful. So I think that is a great place to wrap up our conversation today. Thank you to our listener for sending in this question. To those of you listening, we love hearing from you. If one of our podcasts is really, really, taking off, like in your town, be it Cincinnati or Omaha, or I don't know, wherever you live, New York, no quitting the home team is having a moment. So you can let me know that too, I suppose. But really, questions, suggestions, any of those things, we'd love for you to send them to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.